Well, I think it just speaks to the fact that our electoral processes are a bit outdated if we start thinking about things like that. And, instead of thinking about, being a real participant in the democracy in the place where you live, in the geographic basis that you live, people are thinking about, well, how do I get this candidate elected over here? And how do I make my vote count in other ways? Well, your vote should count where you are. It shouldn't be about figuring out where it counts most and doing this sort of national strategizing. That's not what the country wasn't built around that idea. The country was built around the idea of sending people to government from places. If we start thinking about trying to send people to government from other places, I think that, that in some ways it does a disservice to the overall idea of the democracy.
And I think vote swapping is, as old as the founding of the country. I mean, it's that is a normal part of the political process. It's compromise. I think what we're talking about is really fixing the system so that we're really disenfranchising the voters. The voters are losing their ability to hire and fire their representatives, and that in turn is creating all sorts of other problems.
Oh, well, we have a great site that we put together with a coalition of groups that are working on redistricting reform. It's called endgerrymandering.com. And what I love about the site is you can go there and you can see our Gerrymandering 101 animation from the film. So you can learn what gerrymandering is and how it affects you. And then you can go and put in your address and find out the contours of your state legislative districts, your state senate districts, and your congressional districts. See who represents you. Look at the communities and say, well, why is that there? That doesn't make any sense. Hopefully by the time the election rolls around, we'll also have a tool that will allow you to write directly to your representatives and say, hey, where do you stand on redistricting? If given the opportunity, are you going to draw yourself a district, or are you going to take a stand and try and fix the system?
I guess our hope is that this movie will impact the reform process in two ways. One is that there are initiatives presently on the ballot here in California and in Florida. And as Jeff mentioned, the folks around Proposition 20 are sending out almost 700,000 free copies of the film to voters to encourage them to get educated about this subject and then understand it so that they can vote in an informed way. But the second way that this can impact the process is when the actual redistricting takes place in February, March, and April of next year, when the state legislators are actually drawing the lines. And I think to the extent that more and more people become aware of it and gerrymandering is playing in the theaters, I think it curbs to a certain extent the natural impulses of the state legislature to avoid the most egregious forms of gerrymandering. Those types of gerrymandering that we definitely saw in the last redistricting in 2001.
The situation of minority groups is the most fragile because oftentimes those minority groups are struggling to achieve representation or have just achieved representation. And so maybe they have congressional members who they like, but they've just elected a few electoral cycles ago. And so these people don't, when it comes to the redistricting arguments, they don't really get a seat at the table, unlike a congressman who's been in place for 20 years and there's a real impetus to keep that person in power. But I really think it could be anybody. It could happen to anyone. You could be a white Republican living in a community that you loved and has always been Republican in Texas, and all of a sudden find yourself in a district represented by a liberal from Austin. Is that necessarily fair? Maybe. I mean, not everyone is going to be in a district that they want to be in. Not everyone's going to have the representation that they want. But, we see too often these kinds of things happening. I think we need to work to actually equalize things out a bit more. We think our democracy is so awesome, and to be honest, our democracy has some really great things to recommend it. But I think if you look at other democracies around the world, most of them that have arisen after us have looked at our system and said, "Oh, well, those things actually don't work very well for us. Let's go in some kind of different direction." And so there is this certain, we do have a pride in our system. We also have a lack of civic education. We're never taught really that our system is something that was designed to be changeable to a certain extent and designed to be updated, whereas I think that's a feeling that is held in a lot of other countries around the world. If something is broken, well, let's figure out how to fix it. We think ours is great. We think it's kind of sacrosanct, and we'll tweak around the edges when we have to. Maybe here we'll let women vote, and here we'll figure out how to let African Americans vote, and these kinds of things. But it comes down to real structural questions of reform. Nobody wants to get into that stuff. partially because it's complicated, partially because it's boring, and partially because the people who are elected under that system, they don't want to change the system because it helped elect them, so they like it fine. I would say something that I found that really surprised, it surprised me at first, but as I looked more into it, it actually made a lot of sense. After the 1990 census, throughout the South, you saw the situation where Republican lawmakers were working with African American Democratic lawmakers. Or actually, let me say that it was Republican lawmakers were working with African American caucuses and community groups to draw districts for African Americans in states like Georgia and Alabama and North Carolina and Mississippi. That led to a freshman class in 1994 that had, an exponential increase in the amount of minority candidates elected to Congress. What you also saw was the Newt Gingrich takeover. And a lot of that had to do with the redistricting, the way the lines were drawn, because the Republicans reasoned correctly in a lot of cases that if you drew districts that put as many African Americans into one single district as possible, you would elect a black Democrat, but you'd also elect a lot fewer white Southern Democrats at the same time. And I found it surprising immediately, but then as I started thinking about it, it's like, no, these communities have been, the Democratic Party has been cutting apart African American communities and other minority groups for years because they're a reliable vote for them. So they want African Americans spread into as many districts as possible. That elects lots of white Democrats, but it doesn't elect Democrats who look like the minority communities that exist within those districts. It's an art and a science. It's a balance between, the overall needs of the party, but also the needs of the people within the party. I've always loved, I remember first seeing Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the way he deals with narrative and time in that film, in the sense that you are in the prehistoric era in 1 second, and all of a sudden you are in the far future in another second, or I guess it was the near future more. The idea that cinema could encapsulate all those things in the space of a cut, and then further could also push past that through the idea of some sort of weird, expansive other space at the end through visuals. I always thought it was like, well, okay, well that's what movies should try and do, when they can. And most movies actually don't take those risks and don't take those chances, which is unfortunate. I'd like to see more movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, but unfortunately probably won't.